If you're about to take your private pilot check ride, you're going to love today's video from Free Pilot Training. I've got a DPE that's going to share some of his biggest secrets. He's going to tell us 5 of the most common mistakes that he sees on a check ride. You're not going to want to miss this episode.
Aircraft calling, stay position.
What's going on? I'm Josh from Free Pilot Training. If you're working on your private pilot's license, I've got a really special episode for you today. I've got a designated pilot examiner, or DPE, from the Russellville, Arkansas area. The designated pilot examiner, or DPE, those are the guys that are going to be giving you your check ride, or as the FAA puts it, your practical exam. And when you're first getting started, everyone's talking about the check ride, but that's exactly what that is the practical exam. What's going on, Seth?
Hey, how's it going, Josh? Good to be here.
Good. I got a few questions for you, and then we can roll into those secrets if that works for you.
Cool. Let's go for it.
So what's your mindset, Seth, going into a check ride or a practical exam as an examiner?
Yeah. So my mindset is, first of all, I want to make sure you're going to be a safe pilot. The applicant is safe. That's my mindset. I want to see that when I sign them off and they go out there, they could potentially load up their family in the back of that airplane, go out and fly, and they're not going to hurt themselves or any of their loved ones. And one of the ways that we gauge safety is showing that they have mastery of the aircraft, which the ACS talks about. So having kind of that, being a pilot in command, which you know all about that. It just means that you are the master of that airplane, and you have the confidence and skills that go along with all the necessary things to do, like your takeoffs and landings and the different maneuvers that we practice, as well as the ground knowledge, that you're going to be a safe pilot when you go out and start being a private pilot.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I think a lot of students think that, the DPE is planning to fail them, like as soon as they make a mistake. And I don't really think that to be the case. I mean, you're a DPE. What do you think?
Yeah, no, not at all. One of the things I bring up, I talk about the ACS a lot on my podcast. And one of the things that I like to bring people's attention to is back in the appendix section. It actually kind of goes through some definitions of what could constitute a failure. And in doing so, it talks about how consistently exceeding tolerances is grounds for disapproval.
Okay.
So, the FAA knows that words matter. And so they threw in that word consistently. They didn't just say exceeding tolerances, right?
Okay.
They said consistently exceeding tolerances. And then it goes on to say failure to take prompt corrective action when tolerances are exceeded. So again, words matter. And if you read between the lines of that statement, you realize that the FAA is saying, hey, we kind of expect you to exceed tolerances. As long as you make a prompt corrective action, then that's not grounds for failure. If you don't make a prompt corrective action, then we're looking at grounds for failure. So the ACS in that appendix section, it allows plenty of latitude for you to go out and make mistakes. And I tell all of my applicants that I fully expect you to make mistakes on the check ride. It's how you handle those mistakes that's going to determine the outcome. Because you and I both know when we go out and fly, you're going to mess up. Every time you fly, you make mistakes. Every single time. There is no perfect flight. So it wouldn't be very fair for me to expect you to fly perfectly on your check ride. Now you need to be within tolerances as much as possible.
Yeah, for sure.
But if you make a few mistakes, it's not a big deal. And I'm not looking to fail you. I don't like doing that. I like seeing people succeed. But I'm looking for you to have that safety, involved with flying. Kind of an example of that would be your short field landing. Let's say you're coming in for a short field landing and you get kind of slow and maybe you're a little drug in, and it's just an ugly approach and you decide to go around. Well, maybe you exceeded the ACS tolerances of a short field landing, but you showed me that you had safety in mindset of that. You called your own go around. You did the safe thing. You went around, you came back around and then execute a short field landing that's within tolerances. So that would be an example of you didn't consistently exceed tolerances, but you did once, but then you made a safe decision to recover from that. So that's an example of what I'm talking about there.
For sure. And by the way, guys, if you haven't seen Seth's podcast and YouTube channel over there about the ACS, the Airman Certification Standards, be sure to check that out. He basically gives you the answers for the check ride or the practical exam. So if you haven't already, be sure to make your way over there. There'll be a link in the description. So once this video is over with, you can go check that out. Another question, I guess this kind of leads into this, but what mindset should that student have when they're going into the check ride?
Well, I think the best mindset to have is confidence, is to be knowledgeable and be confident, um, and show me that you have what it takes to be a pilot in command. Because um, once I sign you off as a private pilot, then legally you can go out, you can get in an airplane without asking permission from anyone, and you can go out and fly that across the country into all different types of airspace and even bring people along with you. And if you don't feel comfortable doing that, the airplane doesn't really care. The airplane will act like an airplane, and things will happen. And if you don't have the confidence, then bad things are going to happen
Yeah.
potentially. So that's what I'm looking for in the check ride. Is if you're nervous during a check ride, and this is what I told somebody, had a disapproval a couple weeks ago, and they were disappointed. Obviously, it's never fun to have a disapproval on either side.
Yeah.
And they were like, I was just so nervous. And the maneuver I had to give them a disapproval for was a really critical maneuver. And I was like, well, here's the deal. If you were nervous with me doing this maneuver, what if you were in the plane with your family in the back and you were having to do this maneuver for real?
Yeah.
Um, if you're nervous with a DPE, you're going to be nervous in a real world scenario.
Yeah.
So
That's for sure.
I
Yeah.
want to see you have confidence, because a plane can humble you really quickly, and it can make you a lot more nervous than a DPE ever can.
Yeah.
So if you come into the check ride and you're just really timid and unsure of yourself and just worried about failing, that's not a great mindset to have. Just trust your training that your CFI prepared you. Come in and be confident. You're given all the answers. The ACS has all the questions that I'm going to ask and all the maneuvers that we're going to do, and all the training that you do with your CFI, as long as it's in accordance with the airplane flying handbook and the PHAC and all the FARs. You got what it takes to pass the check ride. So just be confident.
Well, I think that's all I have on that. Let's get into the 5 biggest mistakes that you see when you're giving check rides.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to talk about this.
This is something I've been interested in for a while. I know the mistakes that I made on my private pilot check ride, but I want to see what everyone else is doing this as well. All right. So the number one you told me was the logbook endorsement, which was kind of a surprise to me.
Yeah. Maybe I don't know how to explain this one. Other than maybe instructor enrichment. I'm not saying there's bad instructors. I'm saying that it's easy to get into kind of a rut where your instructor taught you a certain way, and y'all are so focused on writing lesson plans and this, that, and the other, that you kind of skip over the qualification part. And that's what I see with especially younger CFIs, is they've done all the CFI training and they've got this huge binder full of lesson plans. And then when I ask them, an endorsement question on, let's say, a commercial helicopter pilot with a instrument helicopter rating is looking to add his single engine fixed wing commercial add-on, what type of endorsements are required? And I get kind of a deer in the headlights look. So some of those qualification things are a little more complicated and maybe don't get covered in instructor training. So that's what I mean by instructor enrichment, is diving back into learning how FAR 61 works to qualify someone for a check ride. And more importantly, those basic ones, having a real good understanding of knowing that, all right, here's all the endorsements it takes to make a private pilot. And the common endorsements that I see that are messed up are like a 90-day reoccurring endorsement. That endorsement has to happen every 90 days. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen it. I even got a spreadsheet now that during the check ride, the qualification phase, I'll put in actual dates of solos and dates of the 90-day endorsement and make sure that they're all,
That they're all
overlapping.
covered.
Right. And that's an easy one to miss, either not knowing how the 90-day endorsement works, that it's just for 90 days, or I've seen them put the incorrect expiration date on a 90-day. So they endorse it for 90 days, but the expiration date is actually past 90 days.
Okay.
that's a real common one. And so let's say that happens to you. You're an applicant that comes in and you have some solos that were not covered by a 90-day endorsement. You don't go to FAA jail or anything. What happens is those solo hours they can't be used to qualify you for the test.
Okay.
So you can still log those hours, but they cannot be used to qualify you for the test.
So
If that makes sense.
the student, you're saying basically that the students might get in a situation where they're not even eligible to take the test if they don't have
Yeah.
the proper endorsements. That's what you're saying.
Correct. And that's what has happened more often than I would like. And I think all DPs will tell you this: is you show up day of the check ride, and private pilot check rides take a little bit longer than the other ones to qualify for. Maybe commercial and ATP are up there.
Yeah.
But to dig through those endorsements and make sure all of the solos hours that were logged were legal. If I come across and you're right at the minimum of solo hours, and there's a couple solo flights that weren't covered by a 90-day endorsement, well, now all of a sudden you're not qualified and you got to go out and do a couple more hours of solo flying. Now, sometimes it's a documentation issue where the instructor gave the endorsement, but it's not in the student's logbook. It's in a training folder somewhere, and we can usually work through those issues. But the most of them is just the CFI missed it. And what I've noticed is students that have taken a longer time to do their training, and they've gone maybe different flight schools and different instructors over like a 5-year period. They're the hardest students to qualify because they have all these flights for over such a long period of time. Whereas a lot of Part 141 students, they might only have, 2 90-day endorsements. Sometimes just one 90-day endorsement. They've done all their solo recently within the past 90 days. So there's not a lot of endorsements to cover. So if you're one of those students that has been flying for a long time, be prepared to spend some extra time with your CFI prior to your check ride, making sure you organize those endorsements over that long time period, probably from different instructors. You're going to have to take some more time to organize that.
Yeah. And I guess basically, taking ownership of your training. And I know it's a CFI that is mainly responsible, but ultimately you're not going to be able to take your check ride or potentially fail before you even get started if you don't have the proper endorsements. So I guess making sure that you have those proper endorsements.
And we wouldn't be looking at a failure. It would just be a unstart. So we wouldn't even begin the check ride. So it wouldn't be a discontinuance or disapproval. It would just be sorry, you need to go back home and clean this up. Or we need to spend a couple hours here. Sometimes that could lead to a failure, because now I'm having to spend extra time, and you're sitting in my office and you're sweating bullets over there thinking that, oh man, I made the DPE mad. And it's not that I'm mad. It's just, hey, we got to really go through this and make sure you're qualified.
Yeah.
But you probably don't want to spend extra time in the DPE's office than you already have to. So it's in everyone's best interest to have this kind of clean and well organized, and you can come in, verify you're qualified in a short amount of time, and go on with the check ride. I've noticed when the qualification takes longer, generally the oral goes a little bit worse, because now kind of everybody's emotions are a little on edge because they feel like they screwed up the qualification process. And it's just not a good thing.
And you can find those endorsements in 6139, 6187, and then 6193, and then over in the advisory circular 6165H. That's the latest one right now, and you can take a look at those for yourself.
Yep. 6165H. Also, Foreflight has them. Foreflight has all of the endorsements, and they're organized, and you can give them customized names. And when you print off the Foreflight report, that's the 1-page or 2-page logbook, they'll all be at the end of that document, and you could print it out in PDF, pen and ink signature, put it in a nice binder, and it's really well organized. So Foreflight, use those digital tools to help you organize your endorsements a little bit better.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I didn't realize Foreflight did that, but I've been doing a lot of endorsements here lately on Foreflight. And it's super easy. So that's the way to go for sure. All right. Well, the next one we have is knowledge on airworthiness.
Oh yeah. So it's always airworthiness is a challenge, right? And as a private pilot, I have a lot of sympathy, or I have a lot of sympathy for my new private pilots, because there's just so much to know as far as airworthiness goes on is what can make an airplane airworthy, what could potentially make it unairworthy. And the first thing that we tend to latch onto those things that are easy to remember, like tomato flames.
Yeah.
So we hear tomato flames and we're like, that's what I need to be airworthy. Um, I have people, just imagine if you took all the things in tomato flames, just by themselves, and you put them in a room. Just imagine what that would look like. It really wouldn't look like an airplane, right? It
No.
would be a box of parts.
Yeah.
And so if all you have is tomato flames, you can't go out and fly that, right? You can put
Yeah,
them in a
that's true.
box and throw it out the plane, but it's going to crash to the ground. So tomato flames isn't the answer. I like to hear, 91205. Okay,
Okay.
so that's a lot better than tomato flames, because that tells me you're familiar with the FARs and you're familiar, more importantly, with the chapter that discusses airworthiness. And it goes into more detail than just the acronym tomato flames, which
Yeah,
is
for
kind of a
sure.
crutch. That's a good memory aid, but it's really not the whole answer, and it's probably not the best thing to be spouting out in the check ride. But saying 91205, hey, I like that. We can open up 91205 and have a
Yeah.
discussion. Having familiarity with the type certificate data sheet of your airplane, the TCDS. That's a really important document that I've noticed a lot of private pilots have never even heard of. So the TCDS, knowing what airplane or what STCs, so supplemental type certificates your plane has on
Yeah.
board, that's really important and something that gets overlooked a lot. And then that also could go into field approvals. So if your plane has things that aren't, basically customized, they're customized outside of
Yeah.
what the manufacturer initially put on them. Then that can be handled through a 337 and a field approval. So kind of that turns into the whole picture of what a real airworthy airplane looks like.
Yeah.
And if the airplane, hopefully it has an MEL or a KOEL, but if it doesn't have an MEL or KOEL, then have an idea of what is the minimum required equipment. Most airplanes, you can find this. Sometimes it's in the weight and balance section. In the older Cessnas, they'll have an equipment list. So it's not an MEL or KOEL, which is a kinds of operating equipment list, or a minimum equipment list. It's just an equipment list. And it'll list the stuff that's required, and
Yeah.
it'll list the stuff that's optional. And you can cross-reference that with the TCDS. But anyway, the airworthiness is a big thing, and it's really important for a new private pilot to know what an airworthy airplane is, because most of my private pilots aren't airplane owners. So that means
Yeah.
you're going to be going out there and acting as PIC of a rented aircraft or a leased aircraft or something. And that means you could be, touching maybe 5 or 6 different aircraft over the next few months while you're exercising your privileges of a private pilot. And if you don't understand airworthiness, you might be accepting as the pilot in command an airplane that really shouldn't be flying, or has issues that need to be addressed.
Yeah. Yeah. That could definitely happen. And speaking of owners, would you expect like an owner to know more about those things and airworthiness directives and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, we might have a longer conversation on some of that. I I expect my owner to know just as much as the student pilot, but I might
Okay.
dig a little bit more into airworthiness stuff of my owners, and not because just they're owners. It's because a student pilot coming through that's using a school's aircraft. Well, that aircraft, often I've flown that aircraft before, right? So I
Yeah.
don't really need to dig into it as much, because I know that this 141 school is operating this plane, and I've flown it,
Yeah.
16 times before. Whereas my owner comes in and I've never touched this airplane. So just as a pilot myself, I'm going to have to dig into that airplane a little bit more than I do
Yeah.
these other airplanes that are parts of schools, or that are on a school certificate or used in a Part 61 school that I fly regularly. So that is it's not intentional that I'm picking on the owner. It's just out of necessity. Um, if I'm flying an owner's aircraft, often it's the first time I've ever flown that airplane. So myself, before I get in it and do a check ride, I'm going to have to dig a little bit deeper than I do in some of the other airplanes that I fly regularly.
All right. So I think we beat that dead horse. The next one we have is short field landings.
Oh yeah, the short field. So those were the top two items, or the 1 and 2. I won't say that these are necessarily in order, but 1 and 2 are ground. The next 3, 4, and 5 are all going to be flight maneuvers.
Okay.
And I picked short field landing because that's a real common one that I see. It just kind of makes me, slap my forehead, because we're coming in, and the ACS specifically says you can't land short on a short field.
Yeah.
Right. It's -0 plus 200.
Yep.
So I just can't land short. And what we'll do is we'll come in, and I have, hey, the 1,000-foot markers are your aim point. And we come in and everything's looking great. And we pull the power to idle a little early. And instead of, it's obvious that we're going to touch down before the 1,000-foot markers. And instead of going around or adding power to like cheat it a little bit, or any
Yeah.
corrective action, we just accept it, and we just touch down, 300 feet before the 1,000-foot markers. And it just makes me so frustrated, because like all you had to do was add power.
Yeah.
And I even tell people on the front end, you can go around on a short field landing.
Yeah.
It's in the ACS, reasons to do a go around. That's one of the risk
Yeah.
management items.
It's good exercise, good sound judgment, or
Yeah,
risk management.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, okay, once I've started down from base to final, I'm kind of like committed to this landing during a check ride. I get that feeling a lot, that
Yeah.
it's like go around isn't an option. I've got to make this good because the DP's with me. And it's like quite the opposite. I would much rather see you do a couple of go rounds and be like, well, that wasn't really necessary. But I'm never going to fail somebody saying, hey, you went around too many times. I'm just not going to do that.
Yeah.
Because that kind of sets the precedent of, oh, well, going around is bad, and I just failed my
Yeah.
check ride for going around, so I'm never going to go around again. Well, I mean, that could cause an accident. So
That is a
if it doesn't
question I
look
always
good,
had, like,
go
how many
around.
go arounds do you have? I always wondered that.
I always kind of joke and be like, well, we're going to run out of fuel eventually, so we have to land at some point. And that kind of gets them laughing and breaks the ice a little bit, because of course we're not going to run out of fuel. That's silly. But yeah, there's not a limit. The FAA doesn't talk about one in the ACS. There's that term you could go back to that we talked about earlier of consistently exceeding tolerances.
Yeah.
So if you are consistently off airspeed and that's causing you to consistently go around, then that's probably grounds for disapproval.
Yeah.
But what is consistently? Is that 2 out of 3 times? Is that, that's kind of subjective word. So I use it, and so far, nobody's ever tried to abuse that. It's usually 1 or 2 go arounds, and it's a debrief item. That's all.
So this raises an interesting point to me on normal landings. I was kind of looking at the ACS again today on page 21, where it talks about normal landings. And it says that you need to select and aim for a suitable touchdown point, considering the wind, landing surface, and obstructions. So I know that you don't technically have to hit a specific spot on like normal landings, but what do you take that part to mean on normal landings?
Well, if you look down at skill 10 on that page, so if you're on page 21, I'm looking at the private pilot airplane ACS. And so that's area of operation 4, task B, the normal approach and landing.
Okay.
And then there's 12 skills, right? And skill
Yep.
10 is touchdown at the proper pitch attitude within 400 feet beyond or on the specified point. So that's that aim point that we're looking for, is
So
we're looking for on or beyond the specified touchdown point, which for me, 9 times out of 10 is going to be the 1,000-foot markers.
So in this case, you don't get any before either, because it's saying beyond.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And that kind of lines up with part 91, where in a class Delta airport, this is one thing that gets missed by a lot of folks, because it's not just part 91 GA, but if you're in a turbine powered aircraft at a class D airport, it's in the FARs that you have to maintain the visual glide slope.
Yeah, I was actually looking at that the other day.
So if you go under the visual glide slope, that's considered a duck under, and that's actually not legal on a turbine aircraft. we don't, our piston guys don't really talk about that as much because they're not turbine aircraft, but it's kind of one example of it's like, well, if you're planning on being a professional pilot, let's go ahead and train to that standard.
Yeah.
If there's a visual glide slope, you're going to be on it and you will not be below it. And if you're on the visual glide slope, guess where you're aiming? The 1,000-foot markers.
Yeah.
And if you flare right there, guess where you're going to touch down? You're going to touch down within 400 feet of the beginning of the 1,000-foot markers.
Yeah.
So it just lines up kind of with that visual glide slope indicator.
And this raises another good point, which I wanted to bring up since, I just made this video, I guess it's been a couple of weeks now, but should a normal a normal approach be made with power?
Yeah, I think we were talking about this the other day, weren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about it. I always bring up the bigger aircraft because one of the problems is, people wanting to get into the industry and do flying for a living, they're learning to fly in a Cherokee 140 or Cessna 172. It's probably 90% of the people
Yeah.
learning to fly in one of those two similar makes or models. It is possible to do power off approaches consistently in those two types of aircraft.
Yeah.
My question is, will that make you a better pilot in the future? And my answer is no, because when you go on to fly bigger aircraft, you absolutely do not do power off approaches. You have to fly with power because you're flying a stabilized approach. And you're going to fly with power.
Yeah.
You just are. How many times in the C-130, Josh, have you done a power off approach?
Never.
Right? Never, right? You could probably have the weapons school guys design a power off approach, but it would be like a 7.5 degree glide slope or 10-degree glide slope. It would be very unstable and exciting and not something you'd want to do with passengers in the back for sure. So a normal approach, you should have power. And it's going to be low power setting. If your manifold pressure is somewhere around 13 to 15 inches, RPM is going to be around 1,300 to 1,500 RPM, somewhere around there for most aircraft. You're going to have power on a normal approach.
Okay. I've been getting some negative feedback from a few people, and I just wanted to cover my bases there.
Yeah, you can have them if they want to come and talk to me. That's fine. But there's a time and a place for a power off approach. It's called the power off 180. We do it during the commercial and CFI check rides. But that is kind of a mastery of aircraft type of maneuver, and it's not something that you need to be doing regularly. If your goal is to go fly professionally somewhere. Now, if you've got a little Piper Cub, I fly a Piper Cub and a 1939 Taylor Craft with a little 75 horsepower engine, and I fly power off approaches on it all the time, and it's great fun, and it does great doing that. But that doesn't translate to other aircraft. Just because it works in your aircraft that you happen to be using right now doesn't mean that that's like, well, power off approaches from now on, boys. That'd be silly. So
I was just curious about that. Okay, so the next one we have is failure to do clearing turns.
Yeah, this is a surprising one. And I think it happens because you're in the heat of the moment of the check ride and you're like, oh, the DPE just asked me to do steep turns. Let's do steep turns. Remember, you're the pilot in command. So if I ask you to do steep turns, I'm not directing you to do steep turns right now. I'm saying, hey, I would like to see steep turns. Now, as the pilot in command, it's your job to do those steep turns safely and correctly. And part of that is making sure the area is clear. So the two things that I see messed up a lot are rolling straight in the maneuver without doing a clearing turn, or doing a clearing turn and then doing the maneuver looking straight ahead. Right. So we do clearing turns and we kind of look around, right? We do our turns, everything looks good. And they're like, okay, I'm going to start to the left, and we just bank left and their head never moves. I'm like, well, I know we just cleared the area, but go ahead and, okay, I'm clear over here to the left. I'm going to go ahead and turn left. That's part of that mastery aircraft, being a safe pilot in command. So yeah, you just cleared the area, but now look before you turn. That's a really important part of clearing turns.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, I think a part of the thing that I'm seeing on the check ride is people are just wanting to get it over with. And I ask them to do a maneuver, and they've got kind of an authority figure sitting over there to the right that just asked them to do something. So it's like, I better do this. And uh, and if I said, hey, let's do clearing turns first, and then show me steep turns, I'm kind of taking away your responsibility of pilot in command. And
Yeah,
now
for
I'm
sure.
doing the duty of a pilot in command and operating the aircraft safely. So are you really the pilot in command if I'm
Yeah,
telling you to do
something
that stuff?
I kind of teach my guys like gamesmanship, and what we do is like if I'm if he's turning left, I'll say you just say clear left, and then always if you're turning right, just ask it like a question, clear right, and that kind of gets you into
Yeah.
that mentality of like I need to clear every time I'm turning. And so if I'm not actually clear, would I really say that? So it kind of cuts out half of the problem right there. But then the other part is just remembering to do the clearing turns.
Right. Yeah, the other thing that happens that kind of makes me laugh is they'll say, "Would you like me to do clearing turns?" And we haven't done any clearing turns at this point, right? And they ask, "Would you like me to do clearing turns?" And I just sit over there like, I don't know. What do you think? Because I mean, I'm just a passenger over there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, what do you think? Yeah, we need to do clearing turns. We're on your check ride. I just don't know what compels people to ask. Well, maybe my DP doesn't want me to do clearing turns. Well, no, that's yeah, we want you to do it.
Now that you say that, I think there is kind of like this ambiguity for some reason, but yeah, you got to do them.
Yeah, and there's also ambiguity of how often do I need to do a clearing turn. So
Yeah,
I do a clearing turn and then I do two steep turns. And then I ask, okay, let's do a power on stall. I need to do a full set of clearing turns again. There, as far as I know, there's nothing in the FARs or anywhere that says this is how many clearing turns you have to
yeah,
do, or even this is what a clearing turn looks like. Um, so kind of use the smell test of do you feel that the area is still clear? Have we done any maneuvers that have limited our view of a part of the operating area long enough that we need to clear it again?
yeah,
So steep turns, it should be a visual reference maneuver outside of the ATP or CFII rides. But you're not doing that with the foggles on. So you should be looking outside. The area should be clear. You just did two 360-degree turns. So to do clearing turns after you do two steep turns might be a little redundant because in theory, you should have been clearing that whole
yeah,
time.
yeah. Should have been clearing
Uh,
the whole time.
but if I do a power on stall and then configure for slow flight and I'm flying in the same heading for 2 or 3 minutes, now I have kind of limited the view of the operating area behind me and to my left and right, and I've been focused on configuring the aircraft. So that might be a time where, all right, I've been flying north for a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and turn east and clear the area. Sir, does everything look good over there? Yep, looks good. And then we kind of continue the maneuver and kind of do these
Yeah.
box patterns around the pattern. But yeah, there's no magic uh, number that I'm looking for the number of clearing turns. It's just make
Use
sure the
common
area is
sense,
clear.
basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
That makes sense. All right. So the last one we have is emergency procedures.
Yeah. This is my favorite one. And it's so frustrating because, from Air Force training, it's Air Force training, we train a lot of emergency procedures.
Yeah.
Um, you should tell, I don't know if you've done a video of like what stand-ups like in
Oh, it's
UPT,
miserable.
but it's the most stressful thing I've ever been through in my life. Um, but basically during UPT is basically all about emergency procedures. I mean, you talk about every single emergency procedure possible, and it continues like that on every aircraft you fly. Like the C-130, when you go through your annual simulator training, your CRM sim, how many emergency procedures do you do? The whole
A
thing. It's a
lot.
week worth of emergency procedures.
Yeah. Just everything you can
Um,
think of that could possibly go wrong.
right. And so then it's kind of disappointing when I get a private pilot that shows up and we're in the air and I see a bunch of flames coming from the engine. And I would say more than 50% of the time, what happens is their initial action is to go into an emergency descent and or something like that. And I think that's because a lot of CFIs use a fire as a reason to do an emergency descent.
Yeah.
But no engine fire checklist starts with begin an emergency descent. Zero.
Yeah.
There is no emergency procedure that starts like that. They all start with some order of either mixture or the fuel shutoff valve. One of those two things is going to happen first, and then followed by the other one. So it would be the mixture fuel selector or fuel selector mixture. For almost 90% of aircraft that I've flown, that's the first step, is to get fuel away from a fire. So what
Yeah.
that tells me is that you've been out there and you've been practicing the maneuvers, so it's really easy, and it's very clear in the syllabus that, hey, we're going to go do steep turns, we're going to do slow flight, we're going to do power on, power off stalls and short field landings. That's what we're going to do today. There's not a emergency procedures syllabus saying we're going to go up, we're going to do an electrical failure followed by an engine fire, and then we're going to clean up the engine fire, and we're going to go do a loss of your uncommanded power loss. So maybe just a partial engine failure. And then we're going to simulate a severe fuel leak that we see over the wing. So some of those that are just kind of random, like you're doing a clearing turn, you look out and you see fuel streaming out over the wing. What do you do?
Yeah.
That's stuff that's happened to me before. And so our CFIs need to be teaching that.
Yeah.
Because in the Checkride, you know that we're going to ask about emergency procedures. So I think you can do yourself a lot of good is just go during your training at least once a week, do a tabletop emergency procedures review, saying, okay, before we go out and fly, or maybe we just went out and we flew, we did our steep turn, stall, slow flight, short field. Now I would like to talk about electrical failure. So let's go out to the airplane. Let's sit down in the cockpit and let's talk through how we're going to handle an electrical failure. And just do that until you've covered all of the emergency procedures that are in your POH, and that you're really comfortable using those. Because what I've noticed is a lot of flight schools and owner operators, they use these kind of handmade little checklists that are really small and maybe one-sided and have all the common procedures on there, but they don't have emergency procedures. I don't know how many times I've seen a pilot using a little, homemade checklist that's laminated and has all the stuff that they need, but it doesn't have emergency procedures.
Yeah.
So have a plan for, where are your emergency procedures located? Do you have a checklist for them? Some of them, the initial action items of like an engine fire or electrical fire or, getting a pressurized aircraft like a rapid decompression, those should really be, memory items. Memorize the first two steps of every emergency procedure. That probably is not a bad idea.
Yeah, for sure.
Because a little 172 probably only has, 7 or 8 published emergency procedures.
Yeah.
So go ahead and memorize the first two steps of each one. That gives you enough time to then pull out a checklist and know where that checklist is. I had an embarrassing disapproval one time where they were using this laminated fan fold, and I noticed pretty early that it didn't have any emergency procedures, and it was a commercial Checkride. And we go out into the area and they're doing okay, but struggling a little bit. And we get to, I give them an engine fire, and they do the classic emergency descent. And as we're screaming at the ground, I'm like, yep, these flames are getting really bad. This rapid descent seems to have aggravated the fire, which guess what? It absolutely would, because you're like literally fanning the flame and dumping fuel into it. So of course it's going to get worse. I'm like, yeah, I mean, the engine's like really on fire now as the flames are going over. We can't see outside anymore because the windscreen's engulfed in flames. And they're finally like, yeah, I'll pull the mixture and I'll turn the fuel selector off. And I'm like, thank you. You finally got it. I'm like, okay, well, the fire seems to be going out. Let's pull the checklist out for engine fire. And they turned around and looked at me like that I had just asked them to land on the moon. And it turns out they had no idea where the engine fire checklist was in the airplane.
Wow.
They couldn't even reach the POH. And I was like, this is really not good. If you have an emergency like this,
Yeah.
uh, you if you don't have the procedure memorized, which obviously this person didn't, then you really need to know where that checklist is and how to reference it
Yeah.
quickly. And they didn't know how to do that either. So what that told me is, okay, you've kind of focused in on the easy part of the ACS, which are the well-defined maneuvers, like we were talking about, your steep turn stalls, all that. And you kind of glazed over the emergency procedures part, which,
Yeah.
the ACS can't be prescriptive on emergency procedures because they're unique to different aircraft. So it can't make a task for engine fire and for um, rapid decompression and electrical failure because
Yeah.
it's totally unique to that airplane. So it kind of just says, be familiar with emergency procedures. Well, that the onus is on you to look up the POH and figure out what that means.
I like those checkmate checklists. They have
Yeah.
the emergency procedures on the back, and those are really nice.
Yeah. I love Checkmate. That's what we use at our school. And Checkmate will make you custom ones. So
Oh, I didn't know that.
you can actually email them and say, hey, because I've got a 172 that has a couple STCs that are different. So it has a fuel pump and a constant speed prop. And so we had Checkmate make a custom one for us.
Oh,
And
nice. I
it
didn't know.
includes all of those items to capture the STC. And then on the back, you're absolutely right. It has a condensed emergency procedures checklist, which is really nice. So I
Yeah.
really like the Checkmate checklists. Those are really good.
But this, you already kind of touched on it, but it raised a good point. Like when I have a handful of airplane trying to take care of an emergency, I don't want to be pulling out a checklist. That's something I kind of want to have memorized. And so I can focus on flying the airplane instead of sitting there fiddling with the checklist.
Yeah, you don't have to memorize the whole thing, but like I said, the first two steps to
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
maintain aircraft control, put this fire out, or maintain aircraft control, um, figure out, my pitch and power settings. Let's say I have a total electrical failure, um, my the checklist might say try to turn off the alternator and turn it back on. That might be the first step, or pull the alternator circuit breaker and reset it. Or it might be so have that memorized. And if that doesn't work, okay, I'm going to continue maintain aircraft control. Now, let me pull out this checklist. A total electrical failure, although it might be a little scary when it happens, is not going to cause you to fall out of the sky. So there's no rush.
Yeah.
So there's no need to panic, right? You have time to fly the airplane and pull out a checklist. If you know where the checklist is and you know that there's a checklist item for electrical failure.
Yeah. A lot of people have gotten themselves killed by freaking out and not flying the plane and then crashing to the
Oh yeah,
ground.
absolutely. We had, that I think about that global that crashed in Afghanistan. So it was the Bacon mission. So Air Force crew, highly trained, flying a big business jet that's outfitted with all these antennas, and they had an uncontained engine failure is what it sounds like, and a compressor blade kind of ruptured or went through the side of the engine and cut some data link cables and basically gave them some weird indications. And it even knocked out the cockpit voice recorder and the digital flight data recorder. So we don't really know exactly what happened,
Yeah.
but we do know that they shut down the wrong engine.
Yeah.
And so up there at altitude, even an experienced crew, and there's famously a C5 crew that did this. There's been a King Air crew, a couple of King Airs that have shut down wrong engines. And I train multi-engine primarily, so that's what I focus in on. But yeah, let's talk about the engine fire in flight. If you do have an engine fire and you panic and start an emergency descent, that's probably going to lead to a bad outcome. Whereas
Yeah.
if you just turn the fuel off, now guess what? You're not going to have an engine fire anymore. Now you're just a power off aircraft, and you're going to do a glide somewhere and do a forced landing and probably have a safe outcome. If you look at the survival rates of a forced landing, that was actually a forced landing, not a crash, where you
Yeah.
didn't stall, you just landed somewhere. Maybe it wasn't somewhere good, like a parking lot or wherever. The survival rate is like in the high 80s, low 90s. Is
Yeah.
very good. But if you panic and you think the proper reaction to an engine fire is to get on the ground as fast as possible, yeah, this is not good. It's not going to turn out very well.
And I guess the other thing people don't think about too is that, you start diving down to lower altitude where there's more oxygen. That's going to make the fire worse too.
Yeah, definitely could. But it also, it limits your places where you can go,
Yeah.
right? If you're careening towards the ground, that big glide ratio, you're turning it into a single point, and it's just, well, the fire happened, and whatever's directly below me is where I'm going to crash.
Yeah.
So I don't really understand. I don't think people have really thought it through of an emergency descent. We talk about it in private pilot and commercial, and it's an important skill to know. And there's some isolated cases where it might be the appropriate thing to do. I struggle to think of what all of those scenarios are. A cabin
Yeah.
fire, that's definitely a time. If I have a fire in the cabin, yeah, I'm probably going to do an emergency descent. If one of my passengers has a medical emergency, maybe, but really that could also, if I go into an uncontrolled or a unstable emergency descent because the guy next to me passed out and I wind up crashing in the field, I really didn't help him out, right? Especially when maybe you just got hypoxic and passed out. And the best thing for you to do is to take the extra 2 or 3 minutes to do a stabilized approach and land at an
Yeah.
airport, really where emergency descents come into play are the bigger aircraft where you start seeing pressurization issues or issues that could turn into pressurization issues up at altitude. And you've got a really, far area to descend through. So
Yeah.
you've got, 30,000 feet to lose. You need to do that in expedited nature. When you're in a 172 at 8,000 feet, an emergency descent is going to save you maybe 30 seconds to just a normal landing.
Yeah.
It's not going to save you a lot of time. And especially if you expect to have a stable, nice landing at the end of that emergency descent.
Yeah.
So yeah, just kind of think about, and what we're doing right now, by the way, that's a perfect way to talk about emergency procedures.
Yeah, for sure.
Is just
kinda-
ask your student or instructor, hey, what's a time where I'd need to do an emergency descent? And what would that look like?
Yeah.
We
Just
tend to think
clarifying
of
it through your mind.
yeah, and bring it to a logical conclusion because we tend to think of them in a vacuum. So we think of an emergency descent as pull the power, pitch over to the yellow line, and get down as fast as possible. And in the plane, what I think is happening is the instructors, once they get around 1,000 feet AGL, they're like, okay, recover. And then they go on to ground reference maneuvers or something. But just think what you just did there. You just taught an emergency procedure in a vacuum. So you didn't
Yeah.
bring it to a logical conclusion. Because in the real world, an emergency descent doesn't end with you leveling off at 1,000 feet and doing ground reference maneuvers, right?
Yeah.
It needs to end with you finding a place to land. Because why in the heck
Yeah.
did we do that emergency procedure if we don't need to land immediately?
Yeah. And a lot of times I'll try to end them at a field and I'll try to make the radio calls. That way we kind of get some training at the end of it.
Yeah, no, that's really
seems to
good. But then talk about, well, what caused that emergency?
Yeah.
What happened there? Why do we need to get down? Carbon monoxide poisoning, that would be a valid reason. If it's pretty bad and you're starting to notice, hey, I really feel out of my head right now, and I'm about to pass out, then the right thing might be, hey, I'm going to do an emergency descent and I'm going to land in that field over there
Yeah.
while I still have consciousness.
Yeah, very well could be. Well, I think that's all the secrets we have today, but you have a brand new video coming out tomorrow, right? It should be
Yeah,
out by
very
the time
soon.
this video is out.
Yeah, I've got it done. Hopefully, I'm going to finish the edits on it tonight and release it. It's the 25th of February 2022. But yeah, it'll be on my YouTube channel, and I'm probably going to release it in podcast format too. So if you want to listen along and have Foreflight out, it'll still be additive there.
Yeah. So what it is he's going to give you basically how to set up your iPad and Foreflight for the Checkride, and you won't want to miss out on that video. And once that's available, I'm going to put that up here going to put a link up here so you can watch it. And I'll also put a link down in the description. Also, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to click that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And once you finish this video, be sure to either check this video out or make your way over to Seth's channel or his podcast. Those links will be down in the description. It's really going to pay dividends for you on that Checkride. I appreciate you guys watching and have a good one.
All right. Thanks, Josh. See you.
Yeah, no problem. See ya.
Aircraft calling. Say position.